Let's start talking about file statuses. I can tell you when I started to work with plastic in Unity, this topic was confusing the hell out of me until I understood a few basic concepts and setups. My goal for the next couple of minutes is to spare you that experience. In order to make the point I want to make, I think we have to ignore Unity just for a second and purely watch what happens in plastic. For that, we can create an empty workspace. You can go to all workspaces and then just choose the plus. We need a local repository for that. The name doesn't matter. Good. We have an empty workspace. And this time it's really empty as opposed to the workspaces we created before from Unity, which were always automatically populated with the Unity project. The advantage is that we can now observe how plastic is actually behaving without any default Unity flavor. For that, let's quickly open Visual Studio Code and add a few files. The content of the files doesn't matter, so I just add some stupid text in here. And no, the first one is not really serious. Git is also a great piece of software, but plastic is better for Unity. And now for the important part. What does plastic make out of those files? As you can see, all three files are present in the Workspace Explorer with the status private. So what is this private? Personally, I would prefer the term local as opposed to private. In plastics thinking, the files are private to our workspace, so they shouldn't be considered by the version control system yet. By default, this happens to every new file you add to your workspace. And I mean by default because we will see in a second that this is slightly different in Unity. So private files are just local files. If you want them to be considered by plastic, you have to check them in. And in order to check them in, we first have to add them. When I right-click on a file, you can see that I cannot just check in on a private file. I have to choose Add to Source Control first. Why is that the case? Well, typically we don't want to check in single files, although that's possible, but rather check in several files that somehow belong to a logical unit of work. By setting the file status to edit, we can tell plastic which files should go into the next change set. In this case, let's do this with file A only, which brings us to the pending changes view from which we can check in. Back in the Workspace Explorer, we can see that the file status has changed to controlled. And the file now has a green check mark, which means that it is included in the repository. The same result can be reached through the Pending Changes view, where we can just select the files we want and also check in. Let's do that with file B. It is slightly confusing that the status of file B remains private, but under the hood, plastic does the same thing. We can confirm this in the Workspace Explorer, where both files are now controlled. What if you add a file by accident that you didn't want to be part of the repository? Just right-click and undo, which puts the file back to the private state. So private and added are in a sense opposites. Quick question to check our understanding of private files. Remember, files A and B are currently checked in and file C is still private. What will happen when I go back to the very first change set? File C is still there and the other ones are gone. Does that make sense? Why is file C still here? Well, because Plastic does not care about it and just treats it as some file on our file system that it shouldn't touch. So changing to another change set also shouldn't have any effect on the file. This also means that if you let someone else check out your repository, they won't have access to any of your private files. Outside of your computer, file C does not exist. When we go back to the last change set, obviously all three files are present again. It gets slightly more complex once we start working with directories. When I add a directory, the same thing happens and it gets the private status just like a file. But look what happens when I add a file to the directory which is already under version control. Both the moved file and the directory are private again, but Plastic actually knows that this was a move of an existing file, and when I check in, both the file and the directory are now added. Another interesting option with directories is that you can recursively add the directory and all of its contents to version control. For that, I will create another directory with a file. And this time I will choose Add Directory Tree to source control, which will add both the directory and all of its contents. In this case, just the one file. Okay, we are almost done with this digression out of Unity, but there is one last thing that I want to show you. As soon as you have files with the status added in your workspace, Plastic will not allow you to switch to another change set by default, because Plastic doesn't know what to do with those files. For example, when I add file C and then try to switch, I get this message and remain on the same change set. In order to switch, I have to undo the pending changes first, and then everything works as before. There is another solution for situations like that, which we will cover later. Good. Understanding the difference between private and added will really make life easier for you. So let's quickly sum up what we just saw. The key takeaway here is that all the files we initially add to our workspace are just local, or in Plastic terms, private. The repository doesn't care about them yet. In order to get them into the repository, we collect files which we want to be in a change set by giving them a special in-between state called added. Let's say we want to check in the first two files in this workspace, so we add them first. Then once we perform a check-in, those files are now included in the repository and get the control state. I hope this makes some sense. That is basically all you need to know, except that there is a little caveat when we work with the Unity editor, which we will look at next.